Hi scholars, and welcome back to another e-lesson video. This is another Q2 enrichment lesson, this time over connecting rhetorical constraints. So rhetorical analysis is all about examining how a writer goes about achieving their purpose. And we do this by identifying the various techniques and devices that the writer uses and explain what those techniques and devices are intended to do to the audience, how they're intended to affect the audience, and ultimately then explain how those effects on the audience are helping the writer further their purpose. Now, that last part can be a little tricky, trying to explain how a particular strategy helps further the purpose. For instance, it's not terribly difficult to explain how a particular technique is meant to stir pity, but to fully explain how that technique helps further the writer's purpose, how stirring pity helps further that purpose, you need to be able to explain why it's necessary in the first place. Why does the writer need to stir pity? And that is where examining rhetorical constraints can help. So, how should I examine rhetorical constraints in my analysis? First of all, if you're not really sure what rhetorical constraints are, I highly encourage you to check out another YouTube video playlist that I have out there on the basics of rhetorical analysis. This video will assume that you are familiar with what rhetorical constraints are and will focus more on how to apply them in your analysis writing. So think of rhetorical analysis as a process of examining cause and effect. I know I've said that throughout many of these videos and throughout this year in class. The rhetorical strategies that a writer uses being the effect, and the various rhetorical constraints that the writer faces are the cause. When you analyze a rhetorical strategy, ask yourself this: why does the writer use this particular strategy or make this particular rhetorical choice? In other words, what within the rhetorical situation is causing them to do this? To illustrate this concept, let's take a look at another sample prompt. This is the one that you guys just finished writing up last week. This is John Muir's, or the excerpt from John Muir's Save the Redwoods from the year 1900. This prompt did not appear on any exam or released College Board document. This is a self-made prompt. All right, so the overall purpose, which most of you were able to identify pretty successfully on this one, the overall purpose was to inspire the audience to help save the redwoods from logging. And I'm going to use the term redwoods here to just kind of incorporate both the coastal redwoods and the sequoias, which are mainly the subject of his particular essay. So if that's his overall purpose there, one technique that we see him use is personification. A lot of you identified this. It was used 3 or 4 times throughout the whole essay. So that's one of his techniques. He personifies the trees. The intended effect in the audience there's a couple of different effects, but I'm going to go with this one for now. I'm going to say that it's an attempt to stir sympathy for the trees, which is a pathos appeal. So what is a rhetorical constraint that is being addressed through this? What is causing him to do this? Well, I might say something like this, that the people in his audience must have some sort of apathy toward the trees and towards nature. And that, of course, is a rhetorical obstacle that he's trying to overcome by stirring sympathy. Let's take a look at another example here, another technique that we see him use, that allusion in the second paragraph to the crucifixion. The intended effect in the audience there is to stir shame in the audience for implicitly participating in the tree's destruction. It's another pathos appeal here. So we might say that a constraint that is causing Muir to do that would be something like this. People his audience rather, were probably just openly accepting of logging practices at this time, because for a lot of reasons their homes were built out of lumber, their furniture was built out of lumber, and so they probably were just kind of accepting of logging as a necessity. Also, another constraint that we can talk about here is a rhetorical advantage. People's widespread respect for the Bible allows this particular technique to work. If he was addressing a crowd, an audience that wasn't predominantly Christian, then not only would this allusion fall completely flat, but it wouldn't have the same emotional impact. All right, so identifying constraints isn't that difficult. I see a lot of my students are able to identify them successfully. It's explaining them in your essay that can be kind of tricky. You have to be able to explain rhetorical constraints well, or else it really doesn't matter that you see them. I know a lot of you are struggling to get that sophistication point on the Q2 essay, and you're successfully identifying constraints, but you're not explaining them well. And so that's not going to get you that sophistication point. So how do I write about rhetorical constraints in my analysis? Well, when writing about constraints, follow these three principles. One, discuss only constraints that are directly addressed by the strategy you're writing about. Two, explain where the constraints come from, meaning why they exist in the first place. And finally, three, don't forget to explain how the strategy actually addresses the constraint. Don't forget to connect the two together. Let's look at each of those one by one, starting with the first one. Discuss only constraints that are directly addressed by the strategy you are writing about. Remember, you're trying to argue a cause and effect relationship, and you can't do this if you just throw in a constraint that doesn't line up with the strategy being discussed. You can't argue cause and effect if your cause and effect aren't actually related to one another. This is mostly a problem that I see when students want to discuss rhetorical advantages. They try to just slip that advantage in because they know they're supposed to be talking about constraints, but the advantage doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the strategy they just finished explaining in their paragraph. So to illustrate what I'm talking about here by only examining constraints that are directly addressed by the strategy that you're talking about, let's look at another rhetorical strategy from John Muir's essay, starting with the technique. One of the techniques he uses is towards the end. I think this is in the last paragraph or second to last paragraph, where he frames the issue of saving the redwoods as one that only the American people can solve. And of course, the intended effect here is to stir a sense of obligation in his audience to help the trees and to try to conflate saving the redwoods with doing one's civic duty. And that's a sort of pathos appeal there. You might call it an appeal to civic duty, an appeal to patriotism is fine too. I hesitate to use that word, but it works here. So we might say that there's a couple of constraints here as well, that there's no clear emotional connection between the redwoods and people's lives, meaning that his audience likely doesn't feel an emotional connection to the trees or an emotional obligation to them. And then I saw this a lot, that Muir is an expert on the subject, and therefore this helps make his argument even stronger. But there's a problem there. The fact that Muir is an expert on the subject is helping him in some ways. It's helping him, helping build his ethos. But if the strategy I'm talking about is this pathos strategy here, then this particular constraint doesn't belong. Yeah, it is an advantage that exists in the rhetorical situation, but I wouldn't want to throw it in the same paragraph as my discussion of this particular appeal to civic duty, because it just doesn't fit. If I want to bring up the fact that his expertise helps him, I'd want to make sure that it's in a paragraph where I'm discussing an actual ethos building strategy. So if I wanted to talk about that particular rhetorical advantage, here's the kind of strategy I'd want to talk about in a separate paragraph. I might examine the technique that he uses where he shares kind of his personal experiences with working with redwoods and exploring them, that sort of thing. The intended effect here is to portray John Muir as experienced with the subject matter, making him seem more familiar with it and thus more credible on it. And there, I could say that one of the rhetorical advantages helping him do that is the fact that he is an expert on the subject. He's spent a lot of time in these forests, and so he knows them very well, and so he can merely share those experiences. Also, the fact that some in his audience may know that he started and founded the Sierra Club, which is an organization devoted originally to saving these very forests. So that is the kind of overall strategy where I could bring in those ethos advantages there. The second principle of writing about rhetorical constraints: always explain where the constraints come from, meaning why they exist. It's not enough to merely identify the constraint. You have to back up that claim with reasoning, just like you have to back up all claims that you write with reasoning. To back up this particular kind of claim, you just want to explain why that constraint exists in the first place, meaning where within the rhetorical situation does it come from? Let's take a look at an example here. This particular constraint, a lot of you noted, people's apathy toward the trees. This is, of course, an obstacle. And while I had a lot of students who identified this successfully, very few of you actually explained why they were apathetic toward the trees. And that's important. You can't just claim it without supporting it with reasoning. So you might say something like this in order to support your idea. Muir must overcome his audience's apathy toward trees, as there wasn't much of an environmentalism movement back in the year 1900. America was still being settled and industrialized, and little attention was paid to any detrimental effects this might have on nature. There, by just explaining some of the context behind this and the audience's priorities at the time, I'm able to explain why the people were so apathetic toward preserving nature. All right, another constraint you guys talked about a lot was the audience's widespread knowledge of the Bible. This is a rhetorical advantage, but we can't just say that the audience has widespread knowledge of the Bible. We need to back this up. This doesn't take quite as much explanation, but Muir relies on his audience's knowledge of the Bible when he makes his allusion to the crucifixion. As the majority of his audience were Christians, and as the Bible was the most common book found in American households at the time, this is an event his audience would likely recognize. Okay? The third principle for writing about rhetorical constraints: don't forget to explain how the strategy addresses the constraint. Yeah, you've got to explicitly tie the constraint and strategy together. You can't just say the writer does this and that this is getting in his way or this is helping him. You have to explain how what the writer does overcomes the obstacle, or how that particular advantage helps with the strategy. And it should be a simple cause and effect explanation. A lot of times you can do this with just a single sentence. Let's take a look at this particular constraint again: the people's apathy toward the trees, that obstacle. And you can see that part in orange I've added is just a simple statement connecting the two together, or connecting the constraint to the strategy. So Muir must overcome his audience's apathy toward trees, as there wasn't much of an environmentalism movement back in the 1900s. America was still being settled, industrialized, blah, blah, blah. By figuratively presenting, remember we're talking about the personification here, by figuratively presenting the trees as sympathetic creatures, Muir can make his audience more emotionally driven to help him. That's it. That's all it takes, is that one little statement that explains how the personification can help overcome this particular apathy. So here's that other constraint that we looked at: the rhetorical advantage that his audience holds widespread knowledge of the Bible. And I haven't even added a full sentence this time, just an independent clause. That's sometimes all it takes. Muir relies on his audience's knowledge of the Bible when he makes his allusion to the crucifixion. As the majority of his audience were Christians, and as the Bible was the most common book found in American households at the time, this is an event his audience would likely recognize. And the familiarity allows him to communicate his characterization of the trees more easily. That's it. That's all it takes. Let's talk about some common mistakes that students make when trying to discuss rhetorical constraints. Really, I have two big ones here. Be careful that you don't confuse constraints with actual strategies, and don't connect incompatible strategies and constraints. So be careful not to confuse constraints with strategies. Constraints, as I've talked about in class and in other videos, constraints arise from the rhetorical situation. And just like the rhetorical situation, constraints exist before the writer writes or utters a single word. Because of this, constraints cannot come from something the writer does or says in the text, because they already exist before the text is written. And a lot of times I get students who get this confused. They think that once the writer does something, they create this other obstacle or whatever. No, no, no. Once the writer starts doing things, those are just strategies. Those are just choices. The writer can't create new obstacles or advantages as they go. So here's an example of confusing strategies for constraints. Appealing to the audience's religious beliefs through the comparison to Jesus gives the writer an advantage in that it makes him appear more like-minded to the audience. No, there's no rhetorical advantage there. This is just an ethos strategy. That's all that is. Or something like this. Remarking that few people were interested in saving the redwoods until the Calaveras Grove was threatened creates an obstacle for the writer in that the audience might feel too guilty for their past actions, or inaction rather, to start helping now. So Muir attempts to encourage them, and so on and so forth. That's not an obstacle. He can't create an obstacle. This is just a strategy that he has to work with here. He's trying to make them feel guilty for their past inaction, and then he tries to convert that feeling of guilt into encouragement by offering them a way to not feel guilty anymore. So be very careful that you don't assume that something a writer says or does is creating a constraint. That's just another strategy. Next up, don't connect incompatible strategies and constraints. The strategy and constraint that you talk about must both deal with the same type of persuasion. What I mean by that is this. If you're talking about a strategy with an ethos building effect, then the constraints that you talk about have to be ethos-based constraints. If you're talking about a logos effect strategy, you've got to talk about logos-based constraints. Pathos strategy, pathos constraints. They have to work together like that. If a writer's trying to build their character, then the constraint must be character-based. The audience must perceive them in some other way or not have perceptions of their character at all. If the writer is using some sort of logos strategy like an argument, then there must be some sort of logos obstacle that they're trying to overcome, like the audience's unfamiliarity with something or belief in something different. Same with pathos. If they're trying to make the audience feel a certain emotion, it means that they don't feel that emotion or feel a different emotion altogether. So here's some examples of some some compatible strategies and constraints. Something like this. Muir attempts to evoke pity for the trees, that's a pathos effect, in order to overcome his audience's apathy toward nature. It's a pathos obstacle. Or Muir draws upon his years of experience exploring the sequoia and redwood forests, which is an ethos advantage, when he relates his anecdote about witnessing the logging operations firsthand, which is an ethos strategy. Here's an example of rhetorical constraint and strategy that don't make sense together. Something like this. Muir provides statistics on the rate that even a small lumber mill can cut down trees in order to help his audience realize just how destructive logging can be. That's a logos effect because it's an argument, which helps him overcome the audience's apathy toward nature. Well, that doesn't make any sense. You can't make a logical argument to make people feel a certain way. That's the realm of pathos. So those are incompatible because they don't come from the same source of persuasion. All right, to recap, examining rhetorical constraints can help you better explain why a writer does what they do in order to achieve their purpose. Rhetorical analysis, keep in mind, is all about figuring out cause and effect. What is causing the writer to do what they do? When you write about constraints, make sure that you discuss only constraints directly connected to the strategy, explain where the constraints come from, and always connect the constraints back to how it addresses the strategy. Finally, don't confuse constraints for strategy, and be careful that you always connect only compatible constraints and strategies. They have to operate on the same type of persuasion. You can't connect together constraints to strategies that operate on different types of persuasion. So that's all I have for this particular video, and this is our final Q2 enrichment video in this series. As always, scholars, if you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to contact me, and I'll see you when I see you.